I didn't move to this building looking for love. I moved here for the quiet, for the anonymity that a four-story walk-up in a city of millions can afford a man who prefers the company of his own thoughts. My life was a carefully curated collection of routines. The same coffee shop, the same route to my freelance graphic design gigs, the same silent evenings spent staring at a screen, arranging pixels into something that made sense. Something orderly. Caleb was not orderly. He lived in 4B, the apartment directly above mine. I knew this not because we had ever spoken, but because his existence was a percussive assault on my carefully constructed peace. His footsteps were heavy, decisive, pacing at 2 in the morning. His music, often a thrumming bass line that vibrated through my floorboards, was the unwanted soundtrack to my life. He was a disruption, a physical presence I felt through plaster and would before I ever truly saw him. From a distance, he was exactly the kind of man I had spent my life quietly, hopelessly, wanting, broad-shouldered and tall, with a way of moving that seemed to take up more space than he was allotted. I saw him sometimes at the mailboxes, wrestling with packages, or taking the stairs 2 at a time. He had dark, unruly hair that he was always pushing out of his eyes, and a jaw that looked like it was carved from stone. He was, in a word, compelling. He was also, by all accounts, straight. There was a woman, Sarah. I learned her name from a piece of misdelivered mail. She was as bright and loud as he was grounded and rumbling. I'd hear their laughter through the floor, a sound that was somehow more intrusive than the music. It felt like a broadcast of a life I was not a part of, a frequency I couldn't tune into. They were a unit, a fact of the building, as constant as the creak of the main door and the smell of bleach in the hallways. My feelings for him were a secret I kept even from myself most days. A low, persistent hum beneath the surface of my orderly life. It was a foolish, pointless ache for a man who didn't know my name, a man who loved a woman, a man whose heavy footsteps were the only intimacy we would ever share. So I kept my distance. We'd pass on the stairs, and I'd offer a tight, neighborly nod, my eyes fixed on the step just beyond his boots. He'd grunt something in return, his gaze already somewhere else. This was our dynamic, a professional hierarchy of strangers, separated by 12 inches of aging infrastructure and an entire universe of unspoken things. The distance was a fortress. It kept me safe inside my quiet, predictable world, until the day the pipes burst. It began as a stain, a damp, ugly bloom on the ceiling of my kitchen, directly under his. I watched it for an hour, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I willed it to stop, to reverse itself, to be a trick of the light. But it grew, darkening from beige to a deep, ominous brown. Then came the drip. A slow, fat drop of water that landed on my countertop with a sound like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds to a disaster I was not equipped to handle. My routine shattered. My solitude was breached. I had to go up there. I had to knock on his door. My hand trembled as I raised it to the chipped paint of 4B. I could hear the music inside, a mournful guitar riff that seemed to seep through the wood. I knocked once, twice. The music stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I heard the scrape of a chair, the thud of his heavy boots approaching. The door swung open, and there he was. Not from a distance, not as a collection of sound through the floor, but right there. Close enough to see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the faint shadow of a day's worth of stubble on his jaw. He was wearing a faded t-shirt and worn jeans, and he looked bigger, more solid than I had ever imagined. Yeah, his voice was rough, tired. My own voice felt like a foreign object in my throat. I'm Leo, from 3B. Downstairs, he just stared, his expression unreadable. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. Just blank. A wall. There's a leak. I finally managed, the words feeling small and inadequate. My ceiling. It's wet. Something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of alarm. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. Shit. Come in. The disruption of my routine was absolute. I was standing in his apartment. It was the last place on earth I ever expected to be, and it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't just messy, it felt unsettled. There were boxes stacked in a corner, a half-eaten pizza on the coffee table, a single glass beside a bottle of whiskey. It smelled of him, something like sawdust, and clean laundry and the faint, sharp scent of the whiskey. It was overwhelming. He was already in the kitchen, wrenching open the cabinet under the sink. I saw the puddle on the floor before he did. "Ah, hell," he muttered, the words a low rumble of frustration. He crouched down, his broad back to me, the fabric of his shirt stretching taut across his shoulders. I could see the hard lines of muscle, the sheer physicality of him that the floorboards had only ever hinted at. "It's the supply line," he said, his voice slightly muffled. "It's completely shot." I just stood there, useless, in the middle of his chaotic living room. This was his space. This was where he lived and laughed with Sarah, where he paced at night. But there was no sign of her. No feminine touches, no second toothbrush in the holder I could see from the doorway. The place felt hollow, occupied by only one person. He straightened up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. I saw the dark circles under his eyes, the weariness that went bone deep. He wasn't the antagonist from my imagination. He was just a man with a burst pipe and a tired face. "Look, I've shut off the main valve. I'll call the landlord, but they won't get a plumber out here until morning. Your place is probably a mess. It's okay," I lied. My heart was still hammering. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "No, it's not. It's my fault. The valve has been dripping for weeks. I just ignored it." He looked around his own apartment, at the boxes and the general state of disarray, as if seeing it for the first time. "I've been ignoring a lot of things. The forced proximity was a physical weight in the air between us. We were two strangers, bound by a column of water descending through a compromised building. "Where are you going to stay?" he asked, his gaze direct. I hadn't even thought that far. My apartment was a disaster zone. The dripping had become a steady stream. "I don't know. A hotel," I guess. He shook his head, a quick, decisive movement. "Don't be ridiculous. That's a fortune. You can stay here." He gestured vaguely at the couch. "It's a pull-out. Not the best, but it's dry." The offer hung in the air, a shocking, terrifying kindness. Staying here, in his space, breathing his air all night. My internal landscape tilted on its axis. My carefully guarded solitude was about to be invaded by the one person I had worked so hard to keep at a distance. "I couldn't," I said, the protest weak even to my own ears. "Don't argue," he said, and it wasn't a command, but a plea. He looked so tired. "It's my fault. It's the least I can do. Please." And so my fortress crumbled. Not with a bang, but with a drip and a quiet, desperate please. I was going to spend the night in Caleb's apartment. He helped me retrieve a few essentials from my waterlogged home. A change of clothes, my toothbrush, my laptop. He moved with a quiet competence, laying down towels, assessing the damage with a grim expression. He didn't say much, but his presence was a strange comfort. In my own space, which now felt alien and ruined, he was a solid, grounding force. Back upstairs, the awkwardness returned, magnified. We were two men who barely knew each other, suddenly roommates. He pulled out the sofa bed, the springs groaning in protest. He found a set of sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and tossed them onto the mattress. "Bathroom's there. Help yourself to whatever's in the fridge." "Not much, I'm afraid." He retreated to the kitchen, opening the bottle of whiskey again and pouring a generous amount into the glass. He didn't offer me any. I watched him from the doorway of the living room. He leaned against the counter, staring into the bottom of his glass. The confident, intimidating man from the stairs was gone. In his place was someone smaller, weighed down by something much heavier than a plumbing issue. I was observing him up close now, and the details were sharp and painful. A small, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The calluses on his knuckles. The way his shoulders slumped, as if he'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Is everything okay?" The question left my mouth before I could stop it. It was too personal, too forward. We were strangers. He looked up, and his eyes were dark with a misery that stunned me. He gave a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. Is anything ever okay? He took a long swallow of the whiskey. Sarah left, oh. The laughter I used to hear through the floor. The second set of footsteps. It all clicked into place. The boxes in the corner were hers. The hollow feeling of the apartment wasn't my imagination. I'm sorry, I said, the words feeling utterly useless. Yeah, me too. He stared out the window into the dark city. Happened 2 weeks ago. I've just been rattling around in here since. That explained the pacing. The late-night music. He wasn't just being loud. He was grieving. He was trying to fill a silence that had suddenly appeared in his life. A silence I had craved for myself, not understanding the cost. He finally turned to face me, leaning back against the counter. So yeah, that's why I'm such a great neighbor. A faint, self-deprecating smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Welcome to the Heartbreak Hotel. He offered me the bottle of whiskey this time. Want one? Might as well, I nodded, my throat dry. I took the bottle from him, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt, a spark of heat that shot up my arm. My carefully constructed wall of indifference trembled. I poured a small amount into a clean glass, my hand shaking slightly. The contact, however brief, had triggered something. A panic, a flare of that old, hopeless longing. We drank in silence for a few minutes. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. The power dynamic between us had shifted. He was no longer the imposing upstairs neighbor. He was a man in pain, raw and exposed. And I, the quiet observer from below, was now his confidant, his temporary roommate. I was in a position of support, and it leveled the playing field in a way I never could have anticipated. It's the quiet that gets you, he said suddenly, his voice low. You think you want it. You spend your whole life with someone talking, filling the space. And then they're gone, and the silence it's deafening. It's so loud, I knew that silence. I lived in it. I had built my life around it. But hearing him describe it as a wound, as a form of torture, made me see my own solitude in a new, harsher light. I know what you mean, I said softly. He looked at me, a real, searching look this time. Yeah, you live alone. It wasn't a question. I do, you like it? The quiet. The question was so direct, so disarmingly honest. I had to be honest in return. Sometimes. Other times, it's just lonely, a flicker of understanding passed between us. A shared acknowledgement of a fundamental human truth. In that moment, we weren't just neighbors. We were two lonely men, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen, sharing a bottle of cheap whiskey while my apartment filled with water. He drained his glass and set it down with a definitive click. Well, thanks for not calling the cops about the music, I almost smiled. I thought about it for the first time. A genuine smile reached his eyes. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. I bet you did. 3B, it's Leo, I reminded him. Leo, he repeated, tasting the name. I'm Caleb. It felt like a formal introduction, years too late. I'm going to turn in, he said, stretching his arms over his head. The fabric of his shirt pulled tight again, and I had to look away, my heart doing a nervous flutter. Make yourself at home. Seriously. If you need anything, just shout. He disappeared into his bedroom and closed the door, leaving me alone in the vast expanse of his living room. The sofa bed felt like an alien craft that had landed in the center of my universe. I changed into my clothes, the familiar fabric a small comfort in this strange new territory. I lay down, but sleep felt a million miles away. I was hyper-aware of everything. The scent of him on the pillow he'd given me. The sound of him moving around in his room. The soft thud of a boot hitting the floor. The weight of his confession hanging in the air. Sarah left. I had spent months, maybe years, resenting her presence, her laughter, her claim on him. And now she was gone, and all I felt was a profound, aching sadness for him, for the raw pain I had seen in his eyes. My petty jealousy felt childish, shameful. The night was long. I listened to the sounds of the building, the sounds of the city, but mostly I listened for him. I heard him sigh, a deep, shuddering sound that carried through the door. I heard the creak of his bed as he shifted. Each sound was a reminder of his proximity, of his pain. Sometime after midnight, the quiet was broken by a new sound. It was small at first, a choke sob, then another. He was crying. My heart cracked open. The strong, silent man from upstairs was in the next room, weeping into his pillow, and I was the only one there to hear it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to go to him, to offer some kind of comfort. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the fear of overstepping, of misreading the situation. We were still strangers. This was an intimacy I had no right to. So I lay there, in the dark, my own eyes burning with unshed tears, and I listened. I bore witness to his grief, and it felt like the most profound connection I had ever had with another human being. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. I woke up stiff and unrest, the events of the previous night feeling like a strange, vivid dream. I found Caleb in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked even worse than before. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, but he gave me a tight smile. "Morning," he grunted. "Coffee's on, thanks." I poured myself a mug, the ceramic warm in my cold hands. The air was thick with unspoken things. The sound of his weeping echoed in my memory. "Landlord called," he said, staring into his cup. "Plumber's coming at 10. Your insurance should cover the damages," he said. "He'll deal with the ceiling repairs." "Okay. Good." The practicalities felt absurd in the face of the emotional wreckage of the room. We stood in silence for a moment. I needed to say something, to acknowledge what I'd heard. "Caleb," I began, my voice hesitant. "Last night, if you ever need to talk, I'm a good listener." He looked up, and his face was a mask of shame. He thought I was talking about his confession, not the crying. "Yeah, sorry about that. I kind of dump a lot on you, no, it's fine." I meant it. He just nodded, unable to meet my eyes. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by brick. The vulnerability of the night before was being plastered over with morning after regret. I felt a pang of disappointment. I had seen a glimpse of the man behind the facade, and I missed him already. The plumber came, a cheerful man who seemed oblivious to the tension in the apartment. He confirmed the pipe was shot and that the water damage downstairs was significant. It would be days, maybe a week, before my apartment was habitable again. When the plumber left, Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "So, looks like you're stuck with me for a bit longer." The thought sent a wave of both terror and elation through me. More time in his space. More chances for our fingers to brush. More nights listening to him breathe in the next room. "If you're sure it's okay," I said. "It's my fault," he said again, the words a familiar refrain. "You're not imposing," but his eyes said something else. They said, "Don't leave me alone in this silence." The next few days fell into a strange domestic rhythm. I worked from his living room, my laptop perched on his coffee table. He went to his job. He was a carpenter, I learned, which explained the calloused hands and the scent of sawdust. In the evenings, we'd share a pizza or cheap takeout, often in comfortable silence. He started talking more. Not about Sarah, not directly, but about little things. A frustrating client, a memory from his childhood. He told me about building a treehouse with his dad, the scar on his eyebrow from a falling hammer. Each story was a small offering, a piece of himself he was cautiously laying out for me to see. I found myself watching him constantly. The way he concentrated on a task, his brow furrowed. The way he smiled, a rare and brilliant thing that made my breath catch. I learned the cadence of his moods, the subtle shift in his posture that told me he was having a bad day. I was becoming an expert in the language of Caleb. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent summer squall that rattled the windows. The power flickered and died, plunging the apartment into darkness and a sudden, shocking silence. "Well, that's just perfect," Caleb's voice came from the kitchen. I could hear him fumbling in a drawer. A moment later, a match flared and the warm, dancing light of a candle illuminated his face. He looked almost mythic in the flickering glow, his features thrown into sharp relief. He lit a few more candles, placing them around the living room, turning the space into a cozy, intimate cavern against the raging storm outside. This was it, an intimate setting, a classic turning point. My heart was a drum against my ribs. He sat on the floor, leaning against the couch, and motioned for me to join him. I sat a few feet away, the space between us charged with a new kind of energy. The storm provided the perfect cover, a dramatic backdrop for whatever was about to happen. "I hate storms," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on a candle flame. "Me too," I admitted. "It's funny," he continued, his voice barely a whisper above the rain lashing against the glass. "When Sarah and I first got together, she told me she loved them. She said they made her feel small in a good way. Part of something bigger." He paused, and I held my breath. He hadn't mentioned her name in days. I tried to see it that way. I really did. I pretended to love them too. We'd open the windows and listen to the thunder. But all I ever felt was anxious, like something was about to break. He looked at me, his eyes dark and searching in the candlelight. I think I spent a lot of our relationship pretending. The confession hung in the air, more vulnerable than anything he had said before. He wasn't just talking about a storm. Pretending what? I asked, my voice soft. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. To be the person she wanted. The person I thought I was supposed to be. The guy who loves storms and wants a house in the suburbs, and all of it. He let out a long, weary sigh. When she left, she said she didn't know who I was anymore. The worst part is, I think she was right. I don't know who I am either. This was a depth of confusion I hadn't expected. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a full-blown identity crisis. My own long-held secret felt like a heavy stone in my gut. He was laying himself bare, and I was still hiding. It was my turn to be brave. "Maybe you're not supposed to know," I said. "Maybe you just are, and you spend your life figuring out what that means." He looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "And what are you, Leo?" The question was a key, turning a lock deep inside me. "I'm the quiet guy from downstairs," I said, a sad smile on my face. "The one who has been in love with his straight, noisy neighbor for 2 years and was too scared to even say hello to him on the stairs." The words were out. They were just hanging there in the candlelit space between us as thunder cracked directly overhead. I couldn't breathe. I had just detonated my entire world. I waited for the revulsion, the awkward rejection, the polite but firm request for me to find somewhere else to stay. But Caleb didn't move. He just watched me, his expression shifting from surprise to something else. Something I couldn't name. It was intense, and it was focused entirely on me. The silence stretched on, filled only by the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt my face flush with heat. I had made a terrible mistake. I had ruined this fragile, tentative friendship. "You're in love with me?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my eyes stinging. I braced myself for the blow. He slowly, deliberately moved closer. He shifted across the floor until our knees were touching. The contact was electric, a wildfire that spread through my entire body. He reached out, his hand hesitant, and cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, and the gesture was so incredibly gentle it broke me. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down my skin. "Hey," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "Don't do that." He was so close now. I could see the flicker of the candlelight reflected in his dark eyes. I could feel his warm breath on my face. He smelled of rain and wax and something that was just him. "Leo," he said, his name a question. And then he leaned in. It was slow, hesitant, a question in motion. He was giving me time to pull away, to say no. But I was frozen, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze. I couldn't have moved if the building was on fire. His lips touched mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was soft, questioning. It was deeply, achingly honest. It was the taste of whiskey and salt and a confusion that matched my own. His lips were chapped, and the scrape of his stubble was a rough, grounding texture against my skin. I felt a sob rise in my throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. After years of silent longing, of hopeless pining, this was real. He was real. I kissed him back, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, heavy beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was hammering just as fast as mine. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed. I think he breathed, the words a warm puff of air against my lips. I think I've been pretending about a lot more than just storms. And then he kissed me again, and This time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of discovery, of dawning realization. It was the sound of two solitary worlds colliding in the dark, creating a new universe in the space between them. I woke up the next morning in his bed. Sunlight was streaming through the window, bright and unforgiving. The storm had passed. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar weight of his comforter, the scent of his pillow. Then the memories of the night before came rushing back in a tidal wave. The candles, the confession, the kisses. I turned my head. The other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cool. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, coiled in my stomach. A stomach full of bees. I sat up listening. The apartment was silent. Too silent. Not the comfortable, shared silence of the past few days. This was an empty silence. An absence. "Caleb," I called out, my voice raspy. No answer. I swung my legs out of bed, grabbing my t-shirt from the floor. I walked into the living room. The candles were gone, the whiskey bottle put away. The pull-out couch was folded back up, as if it had never been used. It was like the last week had been erased. He was gone. His keys were missing from the hook by the door. His work boots were gone. A quick check of the bedroom closet confirmed it. A duffel bag was missing. He had left. My carefully reconstructed world, the one that had started to include him, shattered into a million pieces. The anxiety was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. I couldn't breathe. It was a mistake. That's all it was. A drunken, grief-stricken, confused mistake. He was heartbroken over his girlfriend, and I was a convenient, sympathetic port in a storm. He had woken up this morning, in the clear light of day, and realized what he'd done. The horror, the regret, must have been overwhelming. So he ran. The self-recrimination was a vicious, repeating loop in my head. I was a fool. I had pushed him, taken advantage of his vulnerability. I had confessed my pathetic, secret love for him and forced him into a situation he couldn't escape. Of course he ran. Who wouldn't? I sank onto the couch, the same couch where he had first offered me a place to stay, and put my head in my hands. The solitude I had once cherished had returned, but it was different now. It was tainted. It was no longer a peaceful fortress. It was a punishment. It was the echo of his absence. I spent the entire day in a state of suspended animation. I didn't eat. I didn't work. I just sat in his silent apartment, waiting. For what? I didn't know. A text? A call? The sound of his key in the lock. Every creak of the building, every footstep on the stairs sent a jolt of false hope through me, followed by a crushing wave of disappointment. The silence was louder than his music had ever been. It screamed at me. He's gone. He's not coming back. You ruined it. By evening, I couldn't stand being in his space anymore. It was a museum of what I had lost. I packed my small bag of belongings and went downstairs. My apartment was still a wreck, smelling of damp plaster and industrial fans, but it was mine. It was my own familiar loneliness. I curled up on my own couch, wrapped in a blanket, and let the cold, hard reality sink in. The push and pull. We had a breakthrough, a moment of impossible intimacy, and now came the retreat. His retreat, and it felt final. I must have fallen into a restless, dreamless sleep. I was woken by a knock on the door. Not a tentative rap, but a solid, urgent pounding. My heart leaped into my throat. I stumbled to the door, my mind a fog of sleep and misery. I looked through the peephole. It was Caleb. He looked terrible, worse than he had after the breakup. He looked like he hadn't slept in a year. His hair was a mess, and his face was pale and drawn. He was just standing there in the hallway, looking utterly lost. I opened the door. We just stared at each other for a long moment. The hallway light cast long shadows, making him look like a ghost. "Hi," he said, his voice raw. E whispered back. Can I come in?" I stepped back, letting him pass. He walked into the center of my ruined living room and just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wouldn't look at me. "I'm an idiot," he said to the floor. "I'm a coward," the clarifying conversation. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might break a rib. "Where did you go?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I drove," he said. "I just got in my truck and drove. All day. I ended up at the beach." I just sat on the sand and watched the ocean and tried to think about what. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, painful honesty. About last night. About you. About everything. He took a deep breath. Leo, I've never done that before. I've never felt that before. Not with anyone. My own fear and anxiety began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. I woke up this morning, he continued, his voice cracking, and you were there, sleeping in my bed, and you looked so peaceful. And it was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in my life. Terrifying? Because it felt right, he said, the words rushing out of him now. It felt more real than anything I had with Sarah, than anything I've ever had. And that scared the hell out of me. Because I don't know what it means. I don't know who I am if I'm not the guy who dates women and builds houses and, the guy I'm supposed to be. He was admitting his fear. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. So I ran, he said, his voice full of self-loathing. I did the most cowardly thing I could possibly do. I left without a word because I didn't know what to say. And I have spent the last 12 hours feeling like the biggest piece of shit on the planet. Because the only thing more terrifying than waking up next to you was the thought of never doing it again. I closed the distance between us. I stood in front of him, close enough to see the exhaustion and the fear and the hope warring in his eyes. You don't have to be the guy you're supposed to be, I said softly. You just have to be you. We can figure the rest out. He searched my face, looking for something. Reassurance. Permission. Are you sure? He whispered. I'm a mess. I don't know what I'm doing. Me neither, I admitted. This is new territory for me too. Being with someone who is actually here. But I think it's worth being scared for. A single tear tracked a path through the grime on his cheek. He reached out, not to kiss me, but to just hold my face in his hands, his calloused thumbs stroking my skin. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness. It felt more intimate than any kiss. I'm so sorry, Leo, he said, his voice thick. For leaving. For scaring you. I was scared, I admitted. I thought I'd lost you. You haven't, he said, his voice firm. You won't. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. He fumbled with the ring for a moment, his fingers clumsy, and slid one of the keys off. It was the key to his apartment. He held it out to me. The symbolic gesture. What's this for? I asked, my voice thick. My apartment is still your apartment, he said. For as long as you need it. For as long as you want it. He pressed the key into my palm, his warm fingers closing around mine. So you can always come up. So I'm not going anywhere this time. It was more than a key. It was a promise. It was an anchor. I closed my hand around it, the metal cool against my skin. Okay, I whispered. Okay, he echoed, a small, exhausted smile finally gracing his lips. Can we go upstairs? Your apartment smells like a swamp. I laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like breaking a fever. Yeah, it does. We went back upstairs, back to his apartment, but it felt different this time. It didn't feel like his space that I was borrowing. It felt like our space. We didn't talk much more that night. The emotional exhaustion was a heavy blanket over both of us. He pulled out the sofa bed again, but this time he climbed in with me. We just lay there, in the dark, facing each other. He took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, holding on like he was afraid I might disappear. There was no anxiety, no fear, just the quiet, steady presence of him next to me. The rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his body. I fell asleep faster than I had in years, anchored by the weight of his hand in mine. The new beginning wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was a series of small, quiet scenes. It was waking up the next morning, and he was still there. He was watching me, a soft, sleepy smile on his face. It was making coffee together in the kitchen, our bodies brushing past each other in the small space with an easy, comfortable familiarity. No sparks, no jolts of panic, just warmth. It was sitting on the couch, my feet in his lap while I worked on my laptop, and he read a book, the silence between us no longer empty, but full of unspoken understanding, of shared presence. It was him, coming home from work, covered in sawdust, and kissing me before he even took his boots off, his lips tasting of sweat and hard work and home. My apartment was eventually repaired, the ceiling pristine and white again, the smell of dampness gone. But I never really moved back in. I kept my things there, but I lived upstairs with him. One evening, months later, we were lying in his bed. Our bed, the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around me, his head resting on my chest. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked quietly. The pipe, I could feel the rumble of his laughter in my ribs. The great flood of 4B. Sometimes he shifted, propping himself up on an elbow to look at me. "It was the best worst thing that ever happened to me. Me too," I said, my hand coming up to trace the scar on his eyebrow. He caught my hand and kissed my palm. "If that pipe hadn't burst, would you have ever knocked on my door?" "No," I said honestly. "Never. I would have just kept listening to your footsteps and wondering, and I would have kept pacing my floor, heartbroken and lost, with no idea that the one person who could make it all make sense was right underneath me the whole time." He leaned down and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss full of a history that was all our own. I looked back at the man I was before him, the man who lived in a fortress of solitude, who curated his life like a museum exhibit, afraid of any disruption. I had built my walls so high to keep the world out, but all they had really done was keep me in. Caleb wasn't just a disruption. He was a demolition. He, and his broken pipe, and his broken heart, had smashed through my orderly life and flooded it with chaos and color and a terrifying, beautiful love. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the loud, messy, wonderful man from upstairs who taught me that the quiet I was searching for wasn't an absence of noise, but the sound of another person's breathing in the dark.